Welcome, weary traveller. It's so wonderful to have you join me on this journey into the depths of history. I hope this can be a soothing and intriguing companion as you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know how far across the globe these stories reach. And if you enjoy this kind of calm, immersive storytelling, please consider subscribing for more relaxing voyages into the past. Now, make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and let your mind wander with me back to the fierce and fascinating world of the Vikings. When most people think of Vikings, they picture hulking warriors in horned helmets, brandishing swords and shields as they leap from longships to raid and pillage. And while there's certainly truth to that image, it's only one small part of a much richer and more complex story. You see, for the Vikings, brutality wasn't just something they inflicted on others. It was woven into the very fabric of their daily lives. From the moment they were born, Vikings faced a harsh and unforgiving world that tested their strength, resilience, and sheer force of will. Theirs was a life defined by back-breaking labor, constant danger, and the ever-present specter of death. But the Vikings didn't just survive in this brutal environment. In many ways, they thrived. Through ingenuity, grit, and a society that valued courage above all else, the Vikings etched their names into history as some of the most fearsome and formidable people to ever walk the earth. And yet, behind the glorious battles and daring adventures we see on TV, the reality of Viking life was often far more grim. In the coming hours, we'll peel back the layers of myth and legend to uncover the true story of the Vikings. We'll explore the harsh realities of their daily existence, from the back-breaking labor of farming to the constant threat of violence and disease. We'll meet some of the most fascinating figures of the Viking Age. Not just the mighty warriors, but also the wives and mothers who toiled behind the scenes, the thralls who labored in bondage, and the outcasts who lived on the fringes of society. Along the way, we'll grapple with some of the deeper questions about Viking culture and its legacy. What drove the Vikings to such heights of conquest and exploration? How did their pagan beliefs shape their worldview and their way of life? And what can we learn from their triumphs and struggles as we navigate the challenges of our own modern world? But before we dive into all that, let's take a moment to set the stage. Imagine, if you will, a small village nestled on the rugged coast of Norway, some 1,200 years ago. It's a cold and misty morning, and the first pale fingers of dawn are just starting to pierce the gloom. The longhouses are still dark and silent, their occupants huddled beneath woolen blankets and furs. But one by one, they begin to stir. Smoke starts to curl from the holes in the thatched roofs as women kindle the hearth fires. Dogs bark and chickens cluck in the muddy lanes between the houses. And down by the shore, where the longships are pulled up onto the rocky beach, a group of men gather to discuss the day's labours. They are farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and traders. Their faces are weathered, and their hands are rough with calluses. Some bear the scars of battle or the marks of old injuries. They are the men of the village, the backbone of this small but close-knit community. And as the sun rises higher in the steel-grey sky, they shoulder their tools and head out to the fields and forests, the forges and the fishing boats, to begin another long and grueling day. This is the world of the Vikings, a world of unrelenting toil interspersed with bursts of wild adventure. And as we'll see, it was a world that demanded everything of those who inhabited it, from the highest lord to the lowliest thrall. So as you burrow deeper under the covers and feel your eyelids beginning to grow heavy, let your mind drift back to that distant time and place, and prepare to experience the Viking Age as you've never seen it before, through the eyes of those who lived it, in all its danger and drudgery, its squalor and its splendor. Our journey begins with a peek inside the fabric of Viking society itself, the complex web of clans, chieftains, and social hierarchies that ordered their world from birth until death. Olaf Tryggvason was one of the most influential figures in the Christianization of Scandinavia. Born into a powerful Norwegian family around 960 AD, Olaf had an eventful life that encapsulates the tensions and transformations of the Viking Age. As a young man, Olaf spent years raiding in the Baltic region and as far as England, amassing wealth, fame, and power. Contemporary sources describe him as a formidable warrior, tall, strong, and skilled in arms. But they also noted his keen mind and force of personality. Even as a youth, Olaf was a natural leader of men. Everything changed for Olaf in 988 AD, when he found himself in England at a critical juncture. Viking attacks had devastated England for centuries, but now the Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred was rallying his forces for a counterattack. Sensing an opportunity, Olaf met with Ethelred and made a fateful deal. In exchange for a vast payment of silver, he would accept baptism into the Christian faith and return home to Norway to claim the throne as a Christian king. It was a stunning reversal. Olaf had made his name and fortune as a pagan Viking raider. Now, he was aligning with the English, abandoning the old gods, and setting out to transform his homeland. The agreement speaks volumes about Olaf's pragmatism and political savvy. He could read the changing tides of history. Christianity was on the rise, and Scandinavia's pagan traditions were waning. If he wanted to seize and hold power in Norway, Olaf knew he would need the support of the Christian rulers of Europe. But Olaf was no passive convert. He approached his new faith with the same zeal and determination that he brought to raiding and war. When he returned to Norway in 995 to claim the throne, Olaf did so as a militant Christian king on a mission to convert his people by force if necessary. He began by targeting pagan places of worship, desecrating sacred groves and tearing down temples. He demanded that his subjects be baptized on pain of torture or execution. According to one grisly account, Olaf had a pagan priest tied to a pole in the midst of his temple, which was then set ablaze. As the flames engulfed the wooden structure, Olaf called out and asked the priest where his gods were now. Not surprisingly, Olaf faced significant resistance from pagan chieftains and commoners alike. He spent years crisscrossing Norway, stamping out pagan rites and crushing any opposition to his rule. In a typical show of force, Olaf summoned a gathering of powerful chieftains to his longhouse. Once they were gathered inside, Olaf's men barred the doors, and the king offered his guests a stark choice: be baptized then and there, or be put to the sword. The chieftains submitted and were marched to a nearby river for a mass baptism. But for all his religious fervor, there was a strong, pragmatic streak in Olaf's kingship. He knew that converting Norway was not just a spiritual task, but a political one. Christianity offered a unifying ideology that could help bind the factious Viking chiefdoms under his rule. The Christian God demanded obedience to authority and to Olaf as his earthly representative. Olaf also used his ties to the church to build alliances abroad. He forged close links with the English king Ethelred and other Christian rulers on the continent. He sponsored missionaries and bishops from abroad, using their expertise to help spread the new faith. In doing so, Olaf was effectively bringing Norway into the orbit of Christian Europe. In the end, Olaf's mission met with mixed success. At the time of his death in battle, in the year 1000, much of Norway had converted to Christianity, at least nominally. But the old pagan ways died hard, especially in remote corners of the land. It would take a few more generations for Christianity to become fully rooted in Scandinavian soil. Olaf himself passed into legend as the great warrior king who had brought the White Christ to Norway. The church even canonized him as a saint and martyr of the faith. In this sense, Olaf had achieved a kind of double immortality, as a Christian saint and as an embodiment of Viking glory and daring. His life is a testament to the complexities of the Viking Age. Olaf was a raider and a missionary, a pillager and a state builder. He straddled the pagan and Christian worlds, drawing power from both. In the end, he helped guide Scandinavia through a time of wrenching change, setting it on a course to join the broader currents of medieval Christendom. As the 11th century dawned, the Viking Age was coming to a close. The old ways were giving way to the new. The pagan gods were ceding ground to the Christian god, and the fierce independence of the Viking chiefdoms was bending to the authority of kingship and the church. It had been a brutal, tumultuous era in the history of Scandinavia and Europe. For centuries, the Vikings had burst forth from their northern homeland to explore, trade, and plunder. Their dragon-proud ships had spread terror from the British Isles to the Caspian Sea. Their restless energy had driven them across the Atlantic to the shores of Newfoundland, centuries before Columbus. But that energy was finding new outlets. Instead of raiding abroad, Scandinavians increasingly focused on building states and societies at home. The wealth and knowledge they had gained from centuries of contact with other cultures was being turned to the development of art, literature, and more stable structures of governance. This is not to say that Scandinavia became peaceful overnight, or that the transition to the medieval era was a smooth one. Habits of violence and local autonomy died hard, but the center of gravity was shifting. The Vikings were becoming Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes. They were finding new identities as the inheritors of a mythic past and as builders of a European future. This process would play out over centuries as Scandinavia became woven ever more tightly into the fabric of European politics, religion, and culture. But the seeds of that transformation had been sown in the Viking Age itself, by the likes of Olaf Tryggvason and a generation of Norsemen who stand astride the fault lines of history. In many ways, the Vikings had been the victims of their own success. Their raiding and trading had opened new horizons, but it had also exposed them to influences that would undermine their traditional way of life. Christianity was just one of those influences, albeit a powerful one. The adoption of Christianity didn't just represent a shift in religious allegiance. It heralded a fundamental change in worldview and social organization. The egalitarian ethos and decentralized power structures of pagan Viking society sat uneasily with the church's emphasis on hierarchy, obedience, and centralized authority. Conversion also brought with it exposure to the art, literature, and learning of Latin Christendom. Runic inscriptions gave way to Latin script. Skaldic verse and pagan sagas made room for devotional poetry and saints' lives. The very rhythms and textures of Scandinavian cultural life were slowly but inexorably transformed. None of this happened in isolation, of course. The Viking world had always been deeply interconnected with the rest of Europe, through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, as well as raid and conquest. Christianity spread along those same channels of interconnection, carried by missionaries, merchants, and returning raiders who had encountered the new faith abroad. What we see in the time of Olaf Tryggvason and his successors is a kind of critical mass being reached, a tipping point at which the balance of cultural forces shifted decisively in favor of Christianity and the medieval European mainstream. It was not an overnight revolution, but a gradual process of assimilation and adaptation that would stretch over generations. This process was not unique to Scandinavia, of course. Across Europe, the waning centuries of the first millennium saw a patchwork of pagan tribal societies steadily incorporated into Latin Christendom, whether by persuasion or compulsion. Scandinavia was one of the last pieces of that puzzle to fall into place, due in part to its geographic remoteness and the strength of its indigenous traditions. But fall into place it did. By the time of Olaf's death in 1000 AD, Norway was a Christian kingdom if a somewhat tenuously so. Denmark and Sweden would follow suit over the following century. Iceland, the most staunchly pagan of the Norse societies, held out until the 11th century before Christian pressure grew irresistible. The passing of the old ways was mourned by some and celebrated by others, but few could deny that it marked the end of an era. The pagan Viking world, with its brutal vitality and restless energy, was receding into the mists of legend. In its place was emerging a new Scandinavia, one that would take its place in the mainstream of medieval Christian Europe. It was a transition marked by contradiction and ambiguity. Christianity did not erase the Viking heritage overnight, any more than the Vikings had erased the pre-existing cultures of Scandinavia. The old myths and customs lingered, often in uneasy coexistence with the new faith. Even today, traces of the pagan past can be glimpsed in Scandinavian folklore, place names, and popular culture. But the tide of history was flowing in one direction. The age of the Vikings was passing, and a new age was being born. It was an age in which Scandinavians would continue to make their mark on the world, but they would do so as Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes, as Christian Europeans rather than pagan raiders. In this sense, figures like Olaf Tryggvason stand as pivotal characters in a grand historical drama. They embody the tensions and transformations of a society in flux, caught between the pull of the past and the call of the future. They remind us that even the most iconic cultures are not static or monolithic, but are constantly evolving in response to internal and external pressures. The Vikings had burst onto the stage of European history with a bang, shaking the foundations of the old order with their daring and audacity. But in the end, they too were absorbed into that order, their distinct identity gradually subsumed into the broader currents of medieval Christendom. It's a pattern we see again and again in history, the barbarian at the gate becoming the defender of the citadel, the outsider becoming the insider, the old ways giving way to the new. The Viking Age, in all its brutal splendor, was no exception to this rule. As we've seen, daily life for most Vikings was a far cry from the romantic image of the noble savage or the swashbuckling adventurer. It was a life of grinding labor and constant struggle, lived at the mercy of a harsh climate and an unforgiving social order. Violence and death were ever-present realities, whether from disease, accident, or the depredations of one's fellow man. But out of that crucible of hardship and adversity emerged a culture of remarkable resilience and vitality. The Vikings were a people who laughed in the face of death, who met the challenges of their world with courage, resourcefulness, and an indomitable spirit. They were farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and traders, warriors and explorers. They were, in short, a microcosm of the human experience, in all its squalor and glory. In the end, perhaps that is the real significance of the Vikings, not as paragons of nobility or depravity, but as a reminder of the common humanity that underlies even the most alien and exotic of cultures. Beneath the surface differences of language, religion, and custom, the Vikings were people like us, struggling to make their way in a world that was often brutal and unfair. And as we've seen, that world was changing in ways that even the most far-sighted of Vikings could scarcely have imagined. The old certainties were crumbling, and a new order was taking shape. The pagan gods were yielding to the Christian God, and the fierce independence of the Viking chiefdoms was giving way to the centralizing power of kings and bishops. It was a transformation that would play out over centuries, and its full implications would not be clear for generations. But in the lives of people like Olaf Tryggvason, we catch a glimpse of the forces that were shaping the future of Scandinavia and Europe. Olaf himself embodies the contradictions and complexities of this pivotal era. A pagan warlord who became a Christian king, a Viking raider who became a missionary of the new faith. Olaf stood astride the fault lines of history, one foot planted firmly in the world of the sagas, the other stepping into the realm of the saints. His story is a reminder that history is not a simple tale of progress or decline, but a complex tapestry woven from the choices and actions of countless individuals. Each of those individuals, from the mightiest king to the lowliest thrall, played their part in shaping the course of events, even if they could not always see the larger pattern that was emerging. As we've journeyed through the Viking Age, from the halls of the chieftains to the hovel of the humble farmer, we've encountered that pattern in all its richness and diversity. We've seen how the Vikings lived and died, how they loved and fought, how they grappled with the great questions of life and death that confront us all. And in doing so, perhaps we've gained a little more insight into our own world and our own place in the great saga of human history. For all the differences that separate us from the Vikings, we are bound to them by the common threads of the human experience, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and tragedies that make up the stuff of life. In the end, that may be the most enduring legacy of the Vikings, not their deeds of daring or their feats of arms, but their reminder of the shared humanity that unites us across the centuries. They were a people who lived life to the fullest, even in the face of the most brutal adversity. And in that, perhaps, they have something to teach us still. As we close the book on this chapter of history, we do so with a renewed appreciation for the complexity and contingency of the human story. The Viking Age was a time of great change and upheaval, a time when the old world was giving way to the new. But it was also a time of great human drama, of individuals and communities grappling with the eternal challenges of existence. In that sense, the story of the Vikings is not a closed book, but an ongoing tale that resonates down the centuries. It is a story that reminds us of the resilience and adaptability of the human spirit, of the capacity for both great brutality and great beauty that lies within us all. And it is a story that invites us to reflect on our own place in the great sweep of history, on the ways in which we too are shaped by the forces of change and circumstance, and on the choices we make in response to those forces. As we lay our heads down to sleep, perhaps we will dream of longships and battles, of silver hoards and soaring runestones. But even if our dreams are more prosaic, we can carry with us the lessons of the Viking Age, the courage to face the unknown, the resilience to endure hardship, and the wisdom to know that even the greatest of eras must someday yield to the tides of change. In that knowledge, let us find the strength to meet the challenges of our own time and to write our own chapter in the ongoing saga of human history. For like the Vikings of old, we too are explorers and adventurers, makers and shapers of the world we inhabit. And who knows what marvels and wonders, what trials and triumphs await us on the horizon of tomorrow. That is a tale yet to be told, a saga yet to be sung. But as we drift off to sleep, let us do so with the confidence that, like the Vikings before us, we have the strength and the spirit to meet whatever fate may bring. Good night, and thank you for joining me on this journey through the brutal and beautiful world of the Vikings. May your dreams be filled with the stuff of legend, and may you wake to a world of endless possibility. For in the end, that is the greatest gift of history, the reminder that we are all part of a story much larger than ourselves, a story that will continue to unfold long after we are gone. And so, as the embers of the hearth fire burn low and the shadows lengthen on the wall, let us take our leave of the Viking Age and set our sights on the future that beckons. For the saga of human history is not yet over, and there are still many chapters to be written. May we write them well, and may they be remembered long after we are gone. Good night, and good luck, my fellow travelers in time. The road ahead is long, but the journey is worth the taking. So let us step out into the night and see where the winds of history will carry us next. So while popular culture often romanticizes Viking raids and warriors, in truth, this brutal lifestyle of constant conflict took a heavy toll. Not just on their victims across Europe, but on the Vikings themselves. Spending weeks at sea in cramped longships, facing the ever-present threats of storms, disease, hunger and battle injuries far from home, the mental and emotional impact of this existence is hard to fathom from the comfort of the modern world. Even the most famous and feared Vikings were not immune to these hardships, as the story of Bjorn Ironside illustrates. A son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Bjorn sought to lead his own ambitious raiding voyage from Sweden down to the Mediterranean. A journey far longer and more perilous than the usual Viking raids on the Baltic or British Isles. Bjorn assembled a fleet and set out in the 850s AD, his sights set on the rich cities of southern Europe. But the vast distance soon took its toll. Beset by storms, stranded for weeks without provisions, many of Bjorn's men succumbed to starvation and sickness long before reaching the Mediterranean. Those who survived the voyage were in a weakened state, and Muslim defenders in Spain dealt Bjorn a resounding defeat. With heavy losses and fewer ships remaining, Bjorn limped back to Scandinavia after years away, his grand expedition ending in disaster. His own brother Halfdan perished on the return journey. For Vikings who did make it back alive from far-flung raids or trading voyages, readjusting to everyday life in Scandinavia could be its own challenge. Constantly vigilant for signs of danger or attack, plagued by traumatic memories, separated from the tight-knit crews that formed on long voyages. Returning Vikings often struggled to reintegrate into village life and the domestic sphere. The immense physical and psychological impact of raiding took a heavy toll on the Vikings. Yet in a society where one's honor and reputation depended on displaying bravery and participating in this brutal lifestyle, there was often no choice but to endure this punishing cycle, season after season, in order to advance socially and economically. The costs were immense, the scars lasting, but this was the price Vikings paid to survive and thrive in their harsh northern world. Compounding these external pressures and dangers was the strict and limiting nature of Viking society itself, including in the realm of religion and belief. For the Vikings were devoted followers of the old Norse gods, like Odin, Thor, and Freya. In this polytheistic system, Vikings believed that one's fate was predetermined, that the gods must be appeased through sacrifice, and that dying bravely in battle was the only way to reach Valhalla, the majestic hall of slain warriors in the afterlife. This warlike mentality, fatalistic outlook, and promise of a glorious death in combat certainly contributed to the Vikings' reputation as fearsome fighters. Yet the Norse belief system was also rigid and uncompromising. In a rapidly changing medieval Europe where Christianity was spreading, Viking leaders faced difficult choices and internal divisions over whether to abandon the old pagan ways. The story of King Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled Norway in the late 10th century AD, epitomizes this tense religious transformation. Exiled as a child, Olaf traveled widely as a Viking raider, even serving in the court of the English king. There, he converted to Christianity and vowed to bring his new faith back to Norway. Returning home, Olaf gained support and became king in 995 AD. As ruler, he sought to impose Christianity in Norway by force, destroying pagan shrines and idols, torturing resistors, and executing those who refused to convert. Olaf made enemies of many pagan chieftains and nobles, who eventually allied with the kings of Sweden and Denmark to rise against him. In a fierce sea battle in the year 1000 AD, Olaf's forces were defeated, and he leaped overboard to his death. His reign had lasted just 5 years, but despite his fall, Olaf had set powerful forces of religious change in motion. Christianity gradually gained ground across Scandinavia in the 11th century AD, its emphasis on peace and salvation an appealing alternative to the endless cycle of Viking violence for many. The old Viking ways of raiding, trading, exploration, and conquest would endure for a few generations more. But the world the Vikings had known, a world of close-knit clans, powerful jarls, pioneer settlements, and daring naval exploits, was fading. As Scandinavian kingdoms centralized, as populations boomed, as Europe's great cities swelled in size and power, there was no longer a place for the Viking lifestyle of raiding and roving. The Vikings, in a sense, became victims of their own success. The great wealth they obtained through plunder financed a golden age in Scandinavia of art, architecture, and learning. But that prosperity came with greater connections to the rest of Europe and powerful cultural influences that gradually eroded the Vikings' distinct way of life. By the 12th century, the Viking Age had ended, a new medieval era emerging in its wake. Looking back, it can be tempting to remember the Vikings as they appear in popular culture, as rugged warrior heroes, all action and adventure. And it's true that Vikings were bold explorers and adept fighters, but their daily existence was defined far more by hardship and brutality than we often realize. For your average Viking, life was a constant struggle against the elements, disease, hunger, and violence, both at home and on distant raids. The Vikings played a pivotal role in European history, establishing trade networks and kingdoms from Russia to Ireland, Canada to Constantinople. But on a human level, the costs were steep. Theirs was an often traumatic existence, steeped in blood and loss, a ceaseless fight for survival and status from birth until an early grave. So while the image of a daring Viking warrior may live on, the grim reality he endured is a sobering reminder of how far we've come, and of the price of progress paid by the past. In a modern age of medicine, plenty, and relative peace, we can be grateful that the age of the Vikings is, mercifully, long gone. And with that thought, we come to the end of this journey into the lost world of the Vikings. I hope you found this boring history informative and relaxing as you drift off. Thanks for tuning in, and good night. As we've seen, the life of a Viking was a far cry from the glamorous, adventurous existence often depicted in popular media. Even for those at the top of the social hierarchy, like the renowned explorer Leif Erikson, daily life was filled with challenges and hardships that would be difficult for most modern people to even imagine. Leif was born into a prominent family, the son of Eric the Red, who founded the first Norse settlement in Greenland. Despite his privileged background, Leif's early years would have been marked by the same struggles that all Viking children faced: a harsh climate, a meager diet, and the ever-present threat of disease and violence. From a young age, Leif would have been expected to contribute to his family's survival, learning the skills of farming, hunting, and sailing that were essential for life in the Viking world. These were not easy tasks, and they would have required long hours of backbreaking labor, often in treacherous conditions. As he grew older, Leif began to accompany his father on expeditions, learning the ways of navigation and exploration that would later make him famous. But these voyages were not the thrilling adventures that we often imagine. They were grueling ordeals, weeks spent at sea in cramped and primitive longships, constantly at the mercy of the elements. Many men who set out on these journeys never returned, victims of storms, shipwrecks, or clashes with hostile peoples in foreign lands. Despite the dangers, exploration was a necessity for the Vikings. a way to find new sources of wealth and resources in a land that often could not sustain them. This was the world that Leif Erikson inhabited, a world where even the most successful and renowned individuals lived lives of constant struggle and hardship. But Leif's story is just one example of the many challenges that Vikings faced in their daily lives. For most people, life was even harder, with little hope of ever rising above their station or achieving the kind of fame and glory that we associate with the Vikings today. The vast majority of Vikings were farmers, eking out a meager existence in a land that was often inhospitable and unforgiving. They lived in small, primitive longhouses, with entire families crowded together in cramped and unsanitary conditions. Privacy was virtually non-existent, and the concept of personal space was an unimaginable luxury. The daily routine of a Viking farmer was a relentless cycle of toil and drudgery, with little time for rest or leisure. From sunrise to sunset, men and women alike worked in the fields, tending to crops and livestock, always at the mercy of the unpredictable Nordic weather. A bad harvest or a harsh winter could mean starvation and death for entire communities. Even for those who managed to eke out a living from the land, life was far from easy. The Viking diet was monotonous and often nutritionally poor, consisting mainly of meat, fish, and coarse grains. Fresh fruits and vegetables were a rarity, and deficiencies in essential vitamins and minerals were common. The lack of proper nutrition, combined with the constant physical toll of hard labor, meant that Vikings often suffered from a host of health problems. Dental issues were rampant, with many people losing most of their teeth by the time they reached adulthood. Arthritis, respiratory diseases, and infections were also common, and the average life expectancy was shockingly low by modern standards. For women, life was especially harsh. While Viking society was not as strictly patriarchal as some other ancient cultures, women still had few rights and little autonomy. They were often seen as little more than property, to be traded and bargained for in marriage alliances between powerful families. The story of Aud the Deep-Minded, a Viking woman who lived in the 9th century, offers a glimpse into the challenges that women faced in this society. Born into a wealthy family in Norway, Aud was married off at a young age to a man she barely knew, as was common practice at the time. Despite her privileged background, Aud's life was one of constant work and hardship. She was responsible for managing her household, which meant long hours spent cooking, cleaning, and tending to the needs of her husband and children. Like most Viking women, she had little say in the major decisions that affected her life, and was expected to bear her hardships stoically and without complaint. But Aud's story also reflects the incredible resilience and strength of Viking women. When her husband died, leaving her a widow with young children to support, Aud took charge of her own destiny. She gathered a group of followers and set sail for Iceland, where she established her own settlement and became a respected leader in her own right. Aud's story is a reminder that even in the harshest of circumstances, Viking women found ways to assert their agency and carve out a place for themselves in a society that often sought to marginalize and oppress them. But her story is also a testament to the incredible challenges that these women faced and the toll that their difficult lives could take. For most Viking women, life was a constant struggle for survival, with little room for personal fulfillment or happiness. They bore the brunt of the domestic labor, caring for children and managing households in conditions that were often squalid and unsanitary. They faced the ever-present threat of disease, malnutrition, and complications from childbirth, which claimed the lives of many women at shockingly young ages. And yet, despite all of these hardships, Viking women found ways to create meaning and beauty in their lives. They were skilled craftswomen, producing intricate textiles and jewelry that are still admired today. They were healers and midwives, using their knowledge of herbs and natural remedies to care for the sick and injured. And they were storytellers and keepers of lore, passing down the myths and legends of their people from one generation to the next. In many ways, it was the women who held Viking society together, providing the backbone of stability and continuity that allowed their communities to endure in the face of constant upheaval and change. Without their tireless labor and unwavering dedication, the Viking way of life could not have persisted for as long as it did. But even the most resilient of Viking women could not escape the spectre of violence that haunted their society. In a world where clan loyalties and family honor were paramount, disputes between individuals and groups often escalated into bloody feuds that could last for generations. These feuds were governed by a strict code of honor and retribution, with insults and slights against one's family or clan demanding swift and often brutal retaliation. Men were expected to defend their honor at all costs, even if it meant risking their lives in battle or single combat. One of the most famous examples of this code of honor in action is the story of Egil Skallagrimsson, a Viking warrior and poet who lived in the 10th century. Egil was known for his quick temper and his skill in battle, and he spent much of his life embroiled in a series of bitter feuds with rival clans and chieftains. One of the most notorious episodes in Egil's life came when he was just a young man, and his father was killed in a dispute with a powerful Norwegian nobleman. Egil took it upon himself to avenge his father's death and set out on a mission of retribution that would consume him for years to come. Over the course of his life, Egil fought in countless battles and duels, always seeking to defend his honor and avenge the wrongs done to his family. He was feared and respected throughout the Viking world for his prowess as a warrior, but his life was also marked by tragedy and loss. In the end, Egil's story is a reminder of the toll that this culture of violence and retribution could take on individuals and families. While the Vikings are often celebrated for their warrior spirit and their courage in battle, the reality is that this lifestyle came at a terrible cost. For every Viking warrior who achieved fame and glory on the battlefield, there were countless others who died young, cut down in the prime of their lives by the swords and axes of their enemies. And for every family that rose to prominence through their skill in combat, there were many more who were torn apart by the endless cycle of violence and revenge. This is the dark underside of the Viking Age, the reality that is often obscured by the romanticized image of the noble warrior that has become so prevalent in popular culture. It is a reminder that for all their achievements and innovations, the Vikings were ultimately a product of their time, shaped by the brutal realities of life in a harsh and unforgiving world. And yet, even in the face of these challenges, the Vikings managed to create a rich and enduring culture that left an indelible mark on the world. Their art, their literature, and their mythology continue to inspire and captivate people to this day, centuries after the last Viking longship set sail. Perhaps this is the true legacy of the Vikings, not the violence and the brutality that so often defined their lives, but the incredible resilience and adaptability that allowed them to thrive in the face of unimaginable hardship. It is a legacy that speaks to the enduring power of the human spirit and to the ability of even the most marginalized and oppressed people to create something beautiful and lasting in the face of adversity. As we look back on the history of the Viking Age, it is important to remember this legacy and to honor the men and women who lived and died in this remarkable time. They may have been born into a world of violence and hardship, but they also gave birth to a culture that continues to enrich and inspire us to this day. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for the Vikings, not just the warriors and the explorers, but the farmers and the craftsmen, the wives and the mothers, the poets and the storytellers. Let us remember the incredible sacrifices they made and the enduring legacy they left behind. In the end, the story of the Vikings is a story of the human condition, of the incredible capacity for both cruelty and kindness, for both violence and beauty that lies within us all. It It is a story that reminds us of the importance of resilience and determination in the face of adversity, and of the power of the human spirit to endure and overcome even the darkest of times. So let us take inspiration from the Vikings and from all those throughout history who have faced the challenges of their time with courage and grace. And let us strive to create a world where the hardships and the brutalities of the past can be consigned to memory, and where all people can live lives of dignity, compassion, and peace. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of the Viking Age. I hope that this exploration of the realities of Viking life has been both informative and thought-provoking, and that it has shed new light on a fascinating and often misunderstood chapter in human history. As we conclude this podcast, I invite you to reflect on the lessons that we can learn from the Vikings and from all those throughout history who have faced adversity with courage and determination. May their stories inspire us to create a better and more just world for all. And with that, I bid you good night and sweet dreams. Thank you for listening to Boring History for Sleep. Life for Viking women was particularly harsh and constrained by modern standards. Unlike the common portrayal of shield maidens fighting alongside male Vikings in popular media, the historical reality is that Viking women were generally expected to labor at home, without any of the glory and excitement experienced by men who went off raiding or exploring. From a young age, Viking girls were trained in domestic skills like cooking, spinning wool, sewing, and other chores necessary to keep a household running. As they grew older, women were responsible for the back-breaking labor of running a farm, milking cows, making cheese and butter, tending animals, preserving food, and the innumerable other tasks required for a family's survival. All this while also bearing and raising children in an age of high infant mortality where many babies did not survive their first year. Viking women had few rights and freedoms. Their marriages were typically arranged by their father or male relatives, with an emphasis on forging strategic alliances between families. They usually had no say in the matter. Once married, a woman came under the authority of her husband, who had the right to divorce her on a whim. While a woman could also divorce in some cases, she had far fewer valid grounds to do so than a man. There were some exceptional Viking women who wielded power and influence, defying the constraints of their society, but they were rare. One such woman was Sigrid the Haughty, a Swedish queen in the late 10th century. Sigrid was born into a noble family and inherited her father's wealth after his death. She married the King of Sweden, Erik the Victorious, and bore him a son who would later become King Olof Skötkonung. After Erik's death, Sigrid ruled as regent for her young son. She was a formidable figure, known for her strong will and political savvy. According to Norse sagas, she had powerful men who displeased her killed, including setting 2 would-be suitors on fire when they got drunk at a feast and offended her with their persistent proposals. While these stories may be embellished, they speak to her fierce reputation. Sigrid went on to marry the King of Denmark, Sweyn Forkbeard, making her queen of both Sweden and Denmark. She influenced Sweyn to establish alliances with Sweden and Norway, increasing the power and reach of the Danish kingdom. But Sigrid's story is very much the exception that proves the rule. The vast majority of Viking women led hard, thankless lives of drudgery and submission, with few of the freedoms and powers that women today take for granted. The hardships of Viking life also took a physical toll, particularly when it came to health. The Viking diet was seriously deficient by modern nutritional standards, consisting heavily of meat and fish, with few vegetables beyond the odd wild root or leaf. In the cold northern climate of Scandinavia, growing crops was difficult, so Vikings relied mainly on livestock for sustenance. They ate pork, beef, goat, duck, chicken, and occasionally horse meat. Fish, especially cod and herring, was a dietary staple for coastal Vikings. The lack of fruits and vegetables meant that vitamin deficiencies and malnutrition were common, skeletal remains from the Viking Age show signs of scurvy, iron deficiency, and other diseases linked to poor diet. Tooth decay was also rampant, exacerbated by the lack of dental hygiene. With no toothbrushes or toothpaste, Vikings' teeth were worn down by the grit in their food. Archaeological evidence shows that tooth loss in adulthood was common. Hard labor also took a toll on Viking bodies. Farm work and fishing were physically punishing, as was rowing longships and engaging in combat. Injuries that would be treatable today could lead to disability or death. The sagas tell of a Viking named Gunnar Hermundarson, a powerful warrior and skilled archer. According to legend, Gunnar could jump his own height in full armor and shoot arrows with his toes, pulling a longbow string back to his ear. While clearly exaggerated, these feats speak to the strength and athleticism required of Viking warriors. But no man, no matter how strong, could escape the aches, pains, and lasting wear and tear of the Viking lifestyle. Arthritis and other joint problems were widespread, as shown by the bent and twisted bones found in many Viking graves. Perhaps the greatest health risk to Vikings was something they had no understanding of: infectious disease. With no germ theory of illness and only primitive folk remedies as treatment, Vikings were helpless against the spread of disease in their often cramped and unsanitary living conditions. Smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery, and pneumonia could scythe through a community with no effective way to stop it. These harsh conditions, combined with the ever-present risks of childbirth, raiding, and conflict, meant that Viking life expectancy was quite low by modern standards. Archaeological evidence suggests that the average life expectancy was around 35 to 40 years, with few living past 50. Many children did not survive to adulthood, succumbing to disease or accidents. Of those that did, men tended to die earlier than women, likely due to their strenuous and dangerous lifestyles. For Vikings, death was a constant companion, an inescapable fact of daily existence. They believed that a person's time of death was predetermined by the Norns, the Norse fates who measured and cut each person's lifeline. In their worldview, the best one could hope for was a good death, one that would be worthy of a tale. For a warrior, this meant dying bravely in battle, sword in hand. But for most Vikings, fishermen, farmers, merchants and housewives, a straw death in bed was the unglamorous reality. The spectre of mortality hung over every aspect of Viking life, adding a grim urgency to their worldview. The Norse religion held that worthy individuals would be chosen by the Valkyries to live on in Valhalla after death, drinking and fighting until the final battle of Ragnarok. But reaching this fabled afterlife was far from guaranteed. For most, the shadowy underworld of Helheim awaited, ruled over by the monstrous goddess Hel. The best a man or woman could do was to live each day to its fullest, knowing that it could very well be their last. This acceptance of life's shortness and brutality suffused Norse culture, showing up in everything from their myths and sagas to their dark humor and bold approach to life. They knew that life was a temporary gift, to be lived with courage and vigor for as long as the Norns allowed. In the Havamal, a collection of Norse wisdom poetry, the god Odin reflects, "Cattle die, kinsmen die, we ourselves also die, but the fair fame never dies of him who has earned it." For most Vikings, fair fame was out of reach, but they faced the harsh realities of their world with a grim determination that we can scarcely imagine today. They toiled and fought and suffered, snatching what joy they could between the hardships. And when the end came, as it does for us all, they aimed to meet it with clear eyes and a courage forged in the unforgiving crucible of the Viking Age. The popular image of the Vikings as axe-wielding berserkers is not entirely wrong, but it misses the fuller picture of the day-to-day struggles that defined their world. Behind each daring raid and clash of swords was a society grappling with dangers and deprivations that we can barely fathom in our comfortable modern lives. From their crude longhouses to their meager diets to the deadly diseases that ravaged their communities, Vikings lived lives of quiet desperation, enduring unimaginable hardships as a matter of course. They found pride and meaning where they could, in their accomplishments, their families, their faith. But life was a brutal and often thankless struggle, with little room for rest or contentment. Women were trapped in a rigid patriarchy, spending their days in endless toil for little reward or recognition. Children faced a gauntlet of dangers, with only a lucky few surviving to adulthood. Men were measured by their strength and daring, but even the mightiest warrior could not escape the pains of injury, disease, and old age. The Viking world was a harsh and unforgiving one, with little pity for the weak or unlucky. And yet, in the face of all this adversity, the Vikings persevered and even thrived in their own way. They built a complex culture that achieved remarkable things, from the great trading centre of Hedeby to the far-flung colonies of Iceland and Greenland. They crafted intricate works of art, from delicate jewellery to elaborate runestones. They sailed across open oceans with a skill and boldness that would not be matched for centuries. In their shortness and savagery, their lives burned all the brighter for the darkness that surrounded them. They knew that each day was precious, and they wrung from it what joy and glory they could, before death claimed them for its own. In the words of the Havamal, the unwise man is awake all night, worrying about everything. When morning comes, he is worn out, and his problems remain unsolved. The Vikings lived with their problems unsolved and their fates hanging by a thread, but they did not let that stop them from experiencing life in all its extremes. They raged against the dying of the light, even as it consumed them. And in doing so, they left a legacy that still captures our imaginations today, not just for their brute ferocity, but for their indomitable human spirit in the face of a world that knew little of mercy or kindness. Though their lives were often nasty, brutish, and short by our standards, there is a strange sort of envy that colours our modern fascination with the Vikings. In a world of soft comforts and existential ennui, we can't help but be drawn to those who lived and died by their own strength and wits, leaving their mark on the world through sheer force of will. The Vikings, for all their faults and foibles, possessed a rare sort of vitality that seems to grow rarer by the day. As we close this exploration of the hardships and brutalities of Viking life, perhaps that is their greatest legacy, not their raids or their riches, but their tenacious grip on life in a world that seemed perversely stacked against it. They knew better than most how quickly it could all be snatched away by a vengeful rival, a hidden disease, a stormy sea, or the cruel whims of the Norns. And yet they lived all the same, boldly, unapologetically, squeezing what colour and fire they could from their meagre allotment of days. For those of us who live in a world of undreamt of abundance and ease, it is a bracing reminder that life has rarely been kind or fair for much of human history. The Vikings endured tragedies and hardships, as a matter of course that would shatter most modern psyches. And yet they found the strength to live on, to fight and love and leave their runes upon the world. So when we look back on the Vikings with a romanticised awe, it is perhaps not just their deeds that capture our imagination, but the dauntless spirit that drove them. In a world that had yet to be tamed, they stood tall and unflinching, staring down each day as it came with a fierceness that still echoes through the centuries. Their lives were undoubtedly harsher and more harrowing than we can fully comprehend from our vantage point of comfort and safety. And yet, in their refusal to bend or break before the unforgiving cruelty of their age, the Vikings left us a strangely inspiring testament to the tenacity of the human will. They walked through the world unbowed and unbroken, even as it battered them from every side. And in that, there is a grim sort of glory that still shines through the blood and darkness of their era. As we close the book on this exploration of the hardships of Viking life, let us carry with us a measure of their resilient spirit. Not their violence or their raiding, but their stubborn, unshakable grip on life in a world determined to snatch it away. They lived fiercely and died young, but they did not go gently into that good night. They raged against the dying of the light with every breath, leaving an indelible mark on history in the process. And so, as we drift off into the welcoming arms of sleep, let us spare a thought for those marauders of old, not just for their deeds and their daring, but for the unyielding human spirit that drove them. In a time of plagues and famines, of mud and blood and icy darkness, they found the strength to live on. May we, in our own way, strive to do the same. As we've seen, life for Viking women was filled with endless domestic chores and grueling physical labor, with few outlets or escapes from this taxing daily grind. But some remarkable women managed to break the mold and make names for themselves on their own terms. One such woman was Sigrid the Haughty, a Swedish noblewoman who lived in the late 10th century. Sigrid was beautiful, intelligent, and strong-willed, qualities that soon attracted powerful suitors from across Scandinavia and beyond. But Sigrid was not content to be merely a political pawn or trophy wife. According to the sagas, she set a bride price for herself of nothing less than the entire kingdom of Sweden. The first man bold enough to seek Sigrid's hand was King Harald Grenski of Vestfold in southern Norway. Harald was handsome and charming, and initially Sigrid seemed to welcome his advances. But when the time came for Harald to pay the bride price and take Sigrid as his wife, she had him and his men burned alive inside a great hall. Sigrid, it seems, was not a woman to be trifled with. Word of this shocking event soon spread across the Norse world, and Sigrid came to be known as Sigrid the Haughty for her uncompromising stance. But rather than deter other suitors, it only seemed to inflame their desire for this beautiful and formidable woman. Next to try his luck was the powerful King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, a passionate advocate for Christianity in the Norse lands. Olaf was determined to make Sigrid his wife, both as a matter of politics and of faith. As a Christian, he considered it his duty to convert this pagan woman and save her immortal soul. But Sigrid was not about to abandon the old gods simply because some pompous king demanded it. "I shall not part from the faith which my forefathers have kept before me," she declared. Incensed by her refusal, Olaf flew into a rage and struck Sigrid across the face with his glove, bloodying her nose. But if he expected this display of dominance to cow Sigrid into submission, he was sorely mistaken. Eyes flashing with fury, she rose to her feet and delivered a warning Olaf would soon come to regret. "This may someday be thy death," Sigrid declared, before storming out and severing all ties with the brash Norwegian king. Sigrid's prophecy would prove true just a few years later, when Olaf Tryggvason met a watery end at the Battle of Svolder. According to the sagas, Sigrid had in the meantime married King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, and the two joined forces with Olaf's rivals to bring about the Norwegian king's downfall. At a pivotal moment in the battle, Sigrid watched from afar while Olaf leapt from his ship into the sea, never to be seen again. While the details of Sigrid's life remain hazy, shrouded in myth and legend, her story speaks to the indomitable spirit of Viking women who refused to simply accept their prescribed lot in life. Through cunning, courage, and sheer force of will, they fought to make their own way in a world stacked against them at every turn. But women like Sigrid were very much the exception in Viking society. For most, life remained a constant struggle of backbreaking work and a lack of basic freedoms. From sunup to sundown, Viking women toiled to keep their families and households running, often with little respite or reward. Washing clothes was a particularly arduous chore for Viking women, as they lacked the luxuries of soap or running water. Instead, they had to rely on ash and lye as crude cleaning agents, which they mixed in large tubs with boiling water. The clothes would be soaked in this harsh solution, then pounded and wrung out by hand before being rinsed in a stream or lake. Adding to the drudgery was the fact that Viking clothing was made almost entirely of wool, a heavy and water-resistant material that was murder to clean. The soap-making process was also highly involved, requiring the burning of wood under controlled conditions to produce the right kind of ash, which was then mixed with animal fat and boiled for days at a time. Even putting food on the table was a constant challenge in the harsh Scandinavian climate. With a growing season of just a few months, Viking women had to work quickly to plant and harvest what crops they could before the first frosts arrived. And with limited food preservation methods available, much of this produce had to be consumed right away, or else be left to spoil. Meat was another cornerstone of the Viking diet, but obtaining it required yet more toil and trouble. Cattle, sheep and pigs all had to be carefully tended throughout the year, a task that largely fell to women and children. And when the time came for slaughter, it was often the women who had to do the dirty work of butchering and processing the carcasses. Hunting and fishing provided some welcome variety to the Viking menu, but these too were risky and labour-intensive undertakings. And while the men were away on these expeditions, or off raiding foreign lands, the women were left to fend for themselves and their families, often for months at a time. As if all this weren't enough, Viking women also had to contend with the constant spectre of childbirth, which remained a leading cause of death for women well into the modern era. Without access to professional medical care or even basic hygiene, many women died in childbirth from infections or complications, leaving their surviving children motherless. Those who did manage to raise their children to adulthood then faced the heartbreak of watching them leave the nest, often never to return. With so many young people lost to accident, disease, or faraway wars, Viking parents learned to harden their hearts and carry on as best they could. Through it all, these women had to maintain a stoic facade, never betraying the depths of their pain or exhaustion. In a society that prized strength and self-reliance above all else, there was little room for weakness or complaint. Viking women were expected to bear their burdens in silence, no matter how heavy they might be. Given all this, it's no wonder that Viking women aged quickly and died young by modern standards. By the time they reached their 30s or 40s, many were already worn down by a lifetime of hardship and struggle, their bodies broken by years of overwork and deprivation. But in the face of such adversity, Viking women also displayed a remarkable resilience and fortitude. They took pride in their hard work and accomplishments, and found strength in their bonds with each other. Through songs, stories, and small daily rituals, they created moments of beauty and meaning in lives otherwise given over to drudgery. And while they may not have had the same freedoms as their male counterparts, Viking women nonetheless played an essential role in holding their society together. It was their tireless labour that kept farms and families afloat, their resourcefulness that saw communities through lean times and hard winters. So the next time you see a Viking woman depicted on screen, whether fighting alongside the men or pining away for an absent husband, remember the reality behind the myth. These were not delicate flowers or damsels in distress, but strong, capable women who endured unimaginable hardships with grace and grit. They may not have had swords or shields, but in their own way, the women of the Viking Age were every bit as fierce and formidable as the men. Theirs was a quiet kind of courage, born of necessity and nurtured in the face of adversity. And while their stories may not be as well known as those of their male counterparts, they are no less worthy of our respect and admiration. So let us honour the unsung heroines of the Viking Age, the women who toiled and suffered and endured so that their families and communities might survive. Theirs was a brutal and unforgiving world, but through their strength and sacrifice, they helped to shape the course of history and pave the way for the generations to come. As we've seen, the popular image of the Vikings as a race of fearsome warriors is only part of the story. In truth, the vast majority of Vikings were simple farmers, craftsmen, and traders, living out their lives in small, tight-knit communities scattered across the Scandinavian landscape. For these ordinary men and women, daily life was a constant struggle against the elements, marked by long hours of toil and precious little in the way of comfort or luxury. From sunup to sundown, they worked to wrest a living from the land and the sea, their fates forever at the mercy of the changing seasons and the whims of the gods. At the heart of this struggle was the Viking diet, which was shaped by the harsh realities of the Scandinavian climate. With a growing season of just a few months, Vikings had to make the most of what little they could grow, relying heavily on hardy crops like barley, oats, and rye. These grains formed the backbone of the Viking diet, providing the raw materials for bread, porridge, and ale, the staples that sustained Viking families through the long, dark winters. But while these foods were filling and nutritious, they could also be monotonous and bland, especially when eaten day after day, month after month. To add some variety to their diets, Vikings also relied on a range of other foods, including dairy products, wild berries and nuts, and of course, meat and fish. Cattle, sheep, and pigs were all raised for food, while hunting and fishing provided a welcome source of protein and flavor. But even these foods could be hard to come by, especially in times of scarcity or famine. In lean years, when the crops failed or the animals sickened, Viking families might be reduced to eating whatever they could scavenge or forage, a meager diet of roots, bark, and even moss. And even in the best of times, the work of putting food on the table was never ending. Cattle and sheep had to be tended, pigs had to be fattened, and crops had to be planted, harvested, and stored away for the winter. This was backbreaking labor that required the efforts of the whole family, from the youngest children to the oldest grandparents. But perhaps the greatest challenge of Viking life was not the work itself, but the toll it took on the body and mind. With little in the way of medical knowledge or treatment, Vikings were vulnerable to a host of illnesses and injuries that could strike at any time, leaving them weakened, disabled, or even dead. Infections were a constant threat in a world without antibiotics, while malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies were all too common among the poor and underprivileged. Childbirth, too, remained a risky and often deadly undertaking for Viking women, who had to rely on the skills of midwives and the strength of their own bodies to see them through. Given all this, it's no wonder that life expectancy in the Viking Age was shockingly low by modern standards. Most Vikings died before they reached the age of 50, and many never even made it out of childhood. Infant mortality was especially high, with as many as half of all children dying before their 5th birthday. For those who did manage to survive into adulthood, old age brought its own set of challenges and indignities. With no pensions or social safety net to fall back on, elderly Vikings had to rely on their families or communities for support, a burden that not everyone was willing or able to bear. In some cases, aging Vikings might even take matters into their own hands, choosing to end their lives on their own terms, rather than fade away into obscurity and despair. The practice of senilicide, the killing of the elderly or infirm, was not unheard of in Viking society, though it remains a controversial and poorly understood topic. But for all the hardships and suffering they endured, the Vikings were also a resilient and adaptable people, with a deep reservoir of strength and determination. Through their ingenuity and grit, they managed to carve out a life for themselves in one of the harshest and most unforgiving environments on Earth. They built sturdy homes and ships, crafted intricate works of art and jewelry, and explored the far reaches of the known world, leaving an indelible mark on history that endures to this day. And while their lives may have been short and often brutish, they were also marked by moments of great joy, passion, and beauty. So as we reflect on the Viking Age and all its complexities, let us remember the men and women who lived and died during this remarkable time, not as bloodthirsty barbarians or noble savages, but as flawed, fallible human beings, struggling to make their way in a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. Let us honor their sacrifices and celebrate their triumphs, while also acknowledging the darker aspects of their society and culture. And let us strive to learn from their example, to face our own challenges with the same courage and determination that carried the Vikings through their darkest hours. For in the end, the story of the Vikings is not just a story of violence and conquest, but of resilience and survival in the face of impossible odds. It is a reminder that even in the bleakest of circumstances, the human spirit can endure and even thrive through the power of community, family, and sheer force of will. So the next time you find yourself struggling with your own battles, whether large or small, remember the Vikings and their indomitable spirit. Draw strength from their example and know that you too have the power to overcome whatever obstacles life may throw your way. And if you ever find yourself tempted to romanticize the Viking Age as a time of adventure and glory, remember the reality behind the myth, the back-breaking labor, the constant threat of disease and violence, the endless cycle of birth and death that marked the lives of even the mightiest warriors and kings. But remember too, the moments of beauty and grace that shone through the darkness, the love between family members, the bonds of friendship and loyalty, the simple joys of a hearty meal or a well-told tale around the flickering light of a hearth fire. These are the things that make us human, and they are the things that endure long after the battles have been fought and the ships have sailed away into the mists of time. They are the legacy of the Vikings and of all the countless generations who came before and after them. A reminder that even in the face of the greatest adversity, life goes on and hope endures. So let us cherish these moments and hold them close to our hearts as we navigate the ups and downs of our own lives. Let us draw strength from the example of our ancestors and face the future with the same courage and determination that carried them through their darkest hours. And let us never forget the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most daunting of challenges, a power that has sustained us through countless generations and will continue to do so for generations to come. For in the end, that is the true legacy of the Vikings and of all those who have struggled and suffered and endured throughout the long, winding course of human history. The end. Let's turn now to the later life of Harald Hardrada, whose story epitomizes both the opportunities and hardships of the Viking Age. As a young man, Harald fought alongside his half-brother Olaf in the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. This fateful clash saw King Olaf killed, while Harald narrowly escaped with his life. Wounded and forced into exile, Harald fled eastward to Russia, finding refuge in the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev. Over the next few years, Harald embarked on a series of adventures in the Eastern Roman Empire, amassing wealth, fame, and power as a commander in the Byzantine Varangian Guard. He fought in campaigns from the Middle East to Sicily, demonstrating tactical brilliance and personal valor. Along the way, he earned the nickname Hardrada, meaning hard ruler, for his strict discipline and leadership. But even as Harald thrived in exile, he never forgot his Scandinavian roots or lost sight of his ultimate ambition, to claim the throne of Norway as his own. After a dramatic falling out with the Byzantine Empress in 1042, Harald began the long journey homeward. His path would lead through Russia, where he married the daughter of his old friend Yaroslav, and then to Sweden, where he joined forces with King Svein Estridsson of Denmark, the enemy of Norway's current ruler, Magnus the Good. In 1046, Harald and Svein launched an invasion of Norway, But in a fateful reversal, Harold switched sides and joined Magnus, forcing Svein to withdraw. Harold's timely defection was rewarded with a power-sharing agreement. He and Magnus would rule Norway jointly, but this arrangement was short-lived. Magnus died just a year later in 1047, leaving Harold as the sole ruler of Norway. Harald Hardrada had beaten the odds, rising from a young, exiled prince to become Norway's king. But even now, at the height of his power, Viking life remained fraught with danger and hardship. Although now the ruler of a prosperous kingdom, Harold was unable to rest on his laurels. He faced near-constant threats, from scheming rivals to Danish invasions to challenges from his own family. In Viking society, even kings were not immune to the cycle of violence and vengeance that governed daily life. In 1048, Harold was dealt a bitter blow when his nephew Osolf murdered his eldest son Bjorn, likely in retribution for Bjorn's own slaying of Osolf's cousin. An outraged Harold responded with shocking brutality, tricking Osolf into attending a feast, then having him seized and hung in the king's own hall. But even as Harold put down threats at home, he looked abroad for new conquest and glory. In 1058, he mounted an expedition to claim the Danish crown, sparking a bitter war that would rage for 2 years. Although Harold ravaged Denmark and captured the key trading centre of Hedeby, he was ultimately forced to abandon his bid and make peace with the Danish king. As the years passed, Harald Hardrada grew ever more ambitious and determined to cement his legacy as one of the great kings of the Viking Age. He ruthlessly centralized power, reforming Norway's laws and founding the city of Oslo. With a tight grip on his kingdom, he amassed ships and men, preparing for one last glorious campaign. In 1066, a 50-year-old Harald Hardrada launched the greatest gamble of his long career, sailing for England with dreams of conquering another kingdom. His invasion would end in disaster at the climactic Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harold fell to an army led by the English king Harold Godwinson. It was a warrior's death, a fitting end for the last of the great Viking kings. Harald Hardrada's remarkable life, full of dizzying highs and devastating lows, illustrates the fine line walked by even the most exceptional Vikings. In a society defined by constant struggle and hardship, even great kings were only ever one step ahead of a violent end. But through cunning, grit, and sheer force of will, Harold left an indelible mark on history and epitomized the Viking spirit. Bold, daring, and unrelenting in the face of adversity. And yet, as remarkable as Harold's story was, it was in many ways an exception to the rule. For the vast majority of Vikings, both men and women, daily life promised no glorious adventures or royal renown, only ceaseless labor and lurking danger. Perhaps no group felt the weight of this harsh reality more heavily than Viking women. While men might dream of far-off lands and battlefield glory, women were tethered to the thankless drudgery of Norse homesteads. Let us imagine a day in the life of one such woman, Aud the Deep-Minded, a wife and mother in 10th century Iceland. Aud awoke before dawn in the close, smoky confines of her family's longhouse. She extracted herself carefully from the tangled sleeping pallet, shared with her husband, children, and several other families. Careful not to disturb the still slumbering household, Aud padded across the packed earth floor to stoke the hearth. As she coaxed the smouldering embers back to life, Aud's mind turned to the long day of labor ahead. There would be animals to tend, meals to prepare, children to wrangle, and cloth to weave. Like all Viking women, Aud would scarcely have a moment to herself from sunup to sundown. With the fire crackling and the longhouse slowly brightening, Aud slipped outside to milk the family's small herd of cattle. The pre-dawn air was crisp and cold, stinging her skin as she squatted on a rough wooden stool. expertly squeezing streams of milk into a waiting pail. The cattle lowed softly, their breath puffing in the chill. Returning to the longhouse, pail in hand, Aud set about making skyr, the thick, sour, yogurt-like staple of the Viking diet. She poured the fresh milk into a large wooden vat, whisking in a small portion of yesterday's skyr to begin the culturing process. Later, she would drain and press the mixture to achieve the proper consistency. As the rest of the household began to stir awake, Aud ladled portions of boiled barley porridge into wooden bowls. Her children, 2 young sons and a daughter, eagerly slurped the hot gruel, while her husband Halfred bolted his share and strode out to survey the family's sheep pasture, with hardly a word of greeting or thanks. With breakfast served and cleared, Aud turned to her next chore, the taxing, time-consuming labour of weaving woolen cloth. All of her family's clothing, blankets and sails depended on her ceaseless toil at the upright loom that dominated one wall of the longhouse. Hour after hour, Aud passed the woolen weft through the warp threads, slowly building up row after row of close-knit fabric. The tedious work left her back and fingers aching, but she had little choice. A Viking wife's worth depended on the quality of her handiwork. A skill honed by a lifetime of practice, Aud could expect to devote up to 35 hours a week to weaving. As the short autumn day began to wane, Aud turned her attention to preparing the evening meal. With her sons out learning to fish and her daughter beside her, grinding grain into coarse flour, Aud set about the familiar routine. Into a large iron pot suspended over the hearth, she tossed handfuls of barley and dried peas, followed by leeks, onions, and the better part of a dried mutton leg. The savoury scent of mutton stew filled the smoky air of the longhouse as Aud's family trickled in from their labours in the field, fjord, and byre. Over the dinner table, Halfred regaled the family with news of a brewing feud with a neighbouring clan whose sheep had crossed a disputed boundary. Aud listened silently, keenly aware that such squabbles all too often erupted into bloodshed. With dinner finished and the children subdued, a weary Aud at last retired to the family's sleeping platform. In the close darkness, surrounded by the breathing and snoring of her loved ones, she reflected on the day that had passed. So much like countless days before. A life of endless work, scarce comfort, and constant uncertainty. This was the stark reality for Viking women like Aud. Not the fantasy of shield maidens and Valkyries, but the grinding labour and dull anxiety of running a household on the harsh edges of the medieval world. With little power, few rights, and virtually no choice over their fates, Viking women bore the brunt of the age's brutality. While their husbands, fathers and sons might occasionally glimpse adventure, glory or wealth on distant raids, Viking women remained bound to the cyclical toil of farm and family, their horizons hemmed by the ceaseless demands of survival. It was a life that left precious little room for rest, joy or self-determination. But in meeting that unforgiving challenge, day after day, women like Aud the deep-minded showed a quiet, uncelebrated heroism, no less vital than the vaunted feats of Viking warriors. Stoic, resilient, and instrumental in holding the world together, these unsung figures were the bedrock upon which Norse society endured, even as Viking men crashed across the stages of history. As sleep at last overtook Aud, the deep darkness of the longhouse enveloped her, the only sound the soft breathing of her children. On the morrow, the daily struggle would begin anew, the animals to tend, the meals to prepare, the fabric to weave. But for a few precious hours, Aud could surrender to the embrace of slumber, gathering strength for the challenges ahead. While Aud's story is fictional, it reflects the sobering historical reality for Viking-era women. It's a perspective often overlooked in our popular imaginings of the period. A world experienced not from the prow of a longship or the crest of a shield wall, but from the close confines of a longhouse the hard seat of a milking stool, the patient warp and weft of a loom. By considering lives like odes, we gain a fuller and more nuanced portrait of this much mythologized era. We see the unromantic truths that lay behind the sagas and the skaldic verses, the ceaseless struggle for survival, the hard limits of a stratified society, the quiet fortitude of those history so often relegates to the margins. So when next we imagine the Viking Age, let us spare a thought for figures like Ord the Deep-Minded. Though they won no battles and seized no crowns, they were the unseen pillars of the Norse world. In their unheralded grit and perseverance, we find the deeper story of the Viking Age, a story not just of conquest and exploration, but of the daily battle to endure at the uttermost edges of the known world. Let's rejoin our exploration of Viking family life by turning to one of the most famous Vikings of all, Leif Erikson. Born around 970 AD in Iceland, Leif was the son of the notorious Eric the Red. Eric had been banished from both Norway and Iceland for murder, eventually settling in a new colony he named Greenland. It was into this tumultuous family that Leif was born. From an early age, Leif's life was shaped by the dual realities of his father's fame and infamy. On one hand, Eric the Red was a respected leader who had successfully established a new settlement in a harsh and unforgiving land. Young Leif would have witnessed firsthand his father's strength, determination, and force of personality. But Leif also grew up in the shadow of his father's crimes and the stain they left on the family name. In a society where family and reputation were everything, this was no small burden for a young man to bear. Leif's story exemplifies how even for the sons of powerful men, the Viking path was not an easy one. He would have been raised with the expectation that he would one day take his father's place and become a leader of men. But in Viking society, such status was not simply handed down from father to son. Leif would have to prove himself as a warrior, a sailor, an explorer, and a man of renown in his own right. This was a harsh apprenticeship that began early. From a young age, Leif would have been trained in the arts of combat and seamanship, learning how to wield a sword and shield, how to navigate by the stars, how to read the waves and the weather. He would have accompanied his father and uncles on raids and trading voyages, witnessing the raw realities of the Viking life, the cramped and uncomfortable conditions on board a longship, the ever-present danger of storms and shipwrecks, the brutal violence of a raid, the strange sights and sounds and smells of foreign lands. For a young Viking boy, there was no gentler introduction to adulthood. You learned through living, and sometimes only by nearly dying. As he came of age, Leif stepped out of his father's shadow to make a name for himself. The Icelandic sagas record that around 1000 AD, Leif sailed from Greenland to Norway, where he met and was converted to Christianity by King Olaf Tryggvason. He then set out on the voyage that would make him famous, becoming the first European to set foot on the North American continent, at a place he called Vinland. Leif's storied life and explorations exemplify the opportunities that were open to Viking men of his status, but also the extreme risks and hardships involved. Very few Vikings ever achieved the fame and renown of a Leif Erikson, but his story reflects the aspirations and harsh realities that shape the lives of all Viking sons. But what of Viking daughters? The hard truth is that for women in Viking society, the path was even narrower and more constricted. A woman's worth and role were defined primarily by her relationship to men, as a daughter, a wife, and a mother. While some elite women like Leif's own sister Freydis achieved renown in their own right, for the vast majority of Viking women, life unfolded within the domestic sphere. From a young age, girls were trained in the vital skills of running a household, cooking, weaving, sewing, tending to children and to livestock. Unlike their brothers, They were not sent off to raid or trade, but were prepared for a life close to home. Their education reinforced that a woman's place was in the longhouse, not on the longship or the battlefield. This is not to say that Viking women were passive or powerless. In the absence of their husbands, they managed the farm and family to a high degree. The sagas abound with astute and ambitious women who shaped the course of events through their counsel and machinations. Figures like Bergthora and Halgerd in Njal's saga, or Gudrun Osvifsdotter in Laxdæla saga. But their sphere of influence, like their sphere of action, was sharply circumscribed compared to that of men. Another inescapable fact of life for Viking women was the constant spectre of male violence. In a society where men were socialized from birth to be aggressive, and where raids and feuds were commonplace, women often found themselves on the receiving end of this aggression, either from enemies or from their own kinsmen. The harsh reality is that the sagas and laws make clear that women, no matter their status, frequently experienced physical and sexual violence at the hands of men. It was not unusual for a woman to be abducted during a raid, to be forced into a marriage against her will, or to suffer beatings or violations from her own husband. And the same society that so prized honor and reputation for men often blamed and shamed women who were the victims of such violence. So while popular culture loves to dwell on the figure of the fierce Viking shield maiden or the seductive sorceress, the reality for most Viking women was a life of toil and childbearing, hemmed in by deeply restrictive gender roles and the constant threat of male aggression. The Viking Age was in many respects especially misogynistic, even by the standards of its time. This was not an easy path to walk. But let's return to Leif Erikson's story to illustrate another facet of the hardships of Viking life. In this case, the ever-present spectre of disease and early death. The saga of the Greenlanders records that after Leif's triumphant return from his Vinland voyage, tragedy befell his family. His father Eric had planned to join Leif's next expedition, but on the way to the ship, Eric's horse stumbled and fell. Already aged and fragile, Eric suffered injuries in this fall that prevented him from traveling. Disheartened, Eric turned back saying, "It is not my destiny to discover more lands than this that we now inhabit." He returned home, where he fell ill and died shortly thereafter. It was a somber reminder that even for the strongest and most renowned of Vikings, life was incredibly precarious. Injury, disease, infection, any of these could fell even great men like Eric in the prime of their lives, much less so in their vulnerable old age. In fact, it is estimated that in Viking Age Iceland and Scandinavia, the average life expectancy at birth hovered around just 30 to 35 years. Even those who survived the perils of childhood could often expect to die by what we would consider middle age, their bodies broken down by hard labor, poor diet, untreated injuries and infections. Very few saw old age as we know it today, and childhood was an especially perilous time. It's estimated that somewhere between 30 to 50% of Viking children died before the age of 5, succumbing to disease, malnutrition, accidents, and infections. Even the children of great lineages were not spared. Of Leif Eriksson's own siblings, at least 2 brothers died in infancy or childhood. It was a rare family that did not know the grief of a child's death. For Viking parents, the joy and pride of child rearing was always shadowed by this grim awareness. From birth, children were precious, but also so terribly fragile and vulnerable. A parent's love was always tempered by the knowledge that at any moment, disease or misfortune might snatch a beloved child away. This lent a certain hardness, a certain fatalism to Viking family life, an understanding that nothing could be taken for granted. And for those children who survived to adulthood, the spectre of an early death was never far away. The sagas are filled with examples of men and women, even heroes and heroines, struck down suddenly by illness or injury in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. It was a world where people aged hard and died young, a fact of life that coloured every aspect of the Viking experience. And yet, in the face of all this uncertainty and hardship, the Vikings endured and even thrived. They built a complex society and culture. They explored and traded over vast distances. They created art and law and literature that endures to this day. It is, in many ways, astounding, but perhaps it is not so surprising after all. For the Vikings, life was struggle. It was all they knew. And in that constant struggle, they found meaning, purpose, even a sort of harsh joy and beauty. They looked death in the eye every day and refused to blink. They understood in their bones that life is fleeting and precious, and so they seized it with both hands, wringing from it all the glory and honor and passion they could, for as long as the Norns granted them breath. In the Viking worldview, this life, as harsh as it was a sort of crucible, a testing ground for the mettle of one's character and courage. To bear all the hardships the world could throw at you, to fight and strive and endure in the face of them, and still hold oneself to a code of honor. That was the challenge and the calling of the Viking life. And those who met that challenge, who lived and died bravely and memorably, could hope that their names and deeds would live on long after their bones were dust. That, then, may be the true legacy of the Vikings, not the horned helmets and bloodied axes of popular imagination, but something at once simpler and more profound. In the face of a short, hard and brutal life, they found a sort of grim and grand purpose, to make their struggles matter, to meet hardship with courage, to wrest meaning and even a fierce kind of beauty from a world that granted them precious little softness or ease. They were a people who looked into the abyss and refused to avert their gaze. There is, in the end, a certain awe-inspiring resilience and humanity in that. So as we close our eyes to sleep, let us spare a thought for these long-ago people and the harsh and difficult lives they led. Let their struggles remind us to meet our own with perspective and grace. And let their resilience and tenacity inspire us to find meaning and purpose in even the darkest of times. We may dream of Vikings tonight, not as caricatures or cartoons, but as fellow souls, striving, struggling, living, and loving as best they can in an uncertain world, just as we do today in our own way. There is a thread that connects us through time, hardship, life, death, and story. In remembering them, in some small way, we remember ourselves. Good night. As we've seen, Viking women had limited rights and opportunities compared to men. They were largely confined to the domestic sphere, responsible for managing the household, raising children, preparing food, and making clothing. Though strong-willed women did exist, like Sigrid the Haughty, who famously burned her suitors alive, they were very much the exception. For most Viking women, their path in life was determined from birth. They had little say in who they would marry, as marriages were often arranged by families to strengthen alliances between clans. A Viking woman was under the authority of her father or brothers, then later her husband. While they commanded some respect as mistresses of the household, Viking women were still seen as subservient to men. They could not participate in Viking parliaments known as things, could not be chiefs, jarls or kings, and if widowed, their inheritance was controlled by male relatives. This lack of agency extended even to the afterlife in Norse religion. While male warriors hoped to ascend to Valhalla if they died an honorable death in battle, women had no such pathway to paradise. The expected role for a woman was to be a dutiful wife and mother. Anything outside that was seen as dishonorable and shameful. So while the Viking shield maiden Lagertha from the TV show Vikings offers an exciting portrayal, in reality, a female warrior would have been extremely rare and faced immense stigma. The simple truth is that for Viking women, life was defined by a very limited set of choices. But Viking men didn't have it easy either. Though they enjoyed more freedoms than women, daily life was still a harsh struggle for survival. Let's explore further by taking a look at the typical Viking diet and its impact on health. The Viking diet was a product of the limited options in the Scandinavian landscape. Agriculture was challenging in the cold northern climate, so the Viking diet skewed heavily towards meat, fish and wild game, with some cereals, fruits and vegetables mixed in. Protein was abundant, but the diet was noticeably lacking in certain key vitamins and nutrients. Bread was a staple, made from rye and barley flour, but it was typically coarse, dense, and not very nutritious by modern standards. Dairy did feature in the Viking diet, mostly in the form of skyr, a sour milk cheese, but there was little fresh milk consumed since lactose intolerance was common. The Viking diet wasn't doing them many favors in terms of health. The lack of fruits and vegetables meant many Vikings likely suffered from nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C was a constant threat, and diseases like tuberculosis found easy prey in the Viking population. Intestinal parasites like roundworm were also common. What's more, the everyday dangers of Viking life took a heavy toll. Hard labor from farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and household chores was extremely taxing on Viking bodies. Injuries were commonplace, and infection was an ever-present risk in an age without antibiotics. Factor in the constant mental strain of feuds and the threat of violence between clans, and it's no wonder the Vikings had startlingly low life expectancy. The average Viking was lucky to live past 40 years old. Many children didn't survive infancy, and childbirth was perilous for Viking mothers. But those who did survive to adulthood couldn't expect a long or comfortable twilight to their lives. If they were fortunate enough to escape death in battle or a violent end, most Vikings still succumbed to disease, malnutrition or injury at what we would consider a very young age. But there are always exceptions, and the Vikings did have some remarkable physical specimens among them. One such man was Gunnar Hamundarson, an Icelandic Viking of the 10th century. The Njál's saga describes Gunnar as uniquely tall and strong, with a powerful physique honed by years of hard labor on his farm. According to the saga, Gunnar performed an incredible feat of strength by single-handedly lifting the massive 600-pound mast of a Viking longship and carrying it down to the water's edge. Whether fact or fiction, this tale speaks to the capacity for superhuman endurance that some Vikings displayed. But for every Gunnar, there were hundreds of Vikings whose bodies broke down under the strain of their brutal lifestyle. So, between a nutrient-poor diet, unceasing physical toil, rampant disease and violence, and the harsh extremes of the Scandinavian climate, the average Viking had the deck very much stacked against them in terms of health and longevity. Adding to that hardship were the conditions of the Vikings' domestic life. The typical Viking family lived in a small, primitive longhouse. Let's examine what that daily existence looked like and how it impacted their quality of life. The mental and emotional toll of this violent lifestyle cannot be overstated. Vikings lived in a world where physical might made right, and any perceived slight or insult could quickly escalate into open conflict. Imagine the constant stress of knowing a neighbor or rival could challenge you to a duel at any time. Or the gnawing dread that your father, brother or son might not return from their latest raid. Or worse, that a rival clan might choose that moment to settle an old score by attacking your home. Even great warriors like Egil Skallagrimsson were not immune to the psychological strain of endless fighting. Egil spent nearly his entire life embroiled in conflict of some sort, much of it fueled by his own hot temper and pride. As a young man, Egil clashed with his father and brother, feeling overshadowed by their accomplishments. He channeled that resentment into violence, lashing out at allies and enemies alike. During a trading expedition to England, Egil killed a man during a game and fled into the wilderness to escape retribution. He survived alone in the forest like an animal, robbing travelers and fighting anyone who crossed his path. This pattern of feuding, killing, and vengeance would continue throughout Egil's long life. In the rare moments of peace between battles, Egil was a farmer, blacksmith, and occasional poet. But even in his old age, safe on his farm in Iceland, Egil reportedly had trouble sleeping due to the memories of all those he had killed. In one famous poem, he laments, "I am an ancient tree, stripped of leaves and branches. My kin are gone, claimed by the greedy earth." For Vikings, it seems there was no escaping the memories and consequences of a violent life, even for the strongest among them. They simply had to endure, toughened by the knowledge that each day could bring a new slight, challenge, raid, or feud. Even in sleep, one suspects these Vikings found little peace, their dreams haunted by the faces of fallen foes and lost loved ones. But the Viking experience was about more than just combat and conflict at home. The Viking Age was also a time of expansion, exploration, and raiding, as Norsemen pushed the boundaries of their known world in their iconic longships. But while these voyages led to glorious discoveries like Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland, they were also crucibles of human suffering. Imagine being crammed into a sleek but small open boat with 30 to 50 other people, spending weeks at sea with limited food and fresh water. Each day brought a new trial: biting cold, blistering sun, drenching rain. The salt spray and ocean swells were relentless, as was the back-breaking labour of rowing when the winds died down. Dysentery and disease were constant dangers in these cramped, unsanitary conditions. Even for experienced sailors, the dangers were very real. Jarl Hakon of Norway reportedly drowned with 600 of his men when their ships went down in a sudden squall. Hakon the Great of Denmark also drowned when his royal flagship capsized near the end of his life. For the Vikings, the sea was both their greatest ally and a merciless adversary. Those who survived the voyage then had to summon the energy to fight, often against desperate defenders or even other Viking raiders. They might seize plunder and glory, or suffer inglorious defeat far from home, bleeding out from wounds gone septic. At best, they could hope to limp back to their ships laden with spoils. At worst, they might be stranded in hostile territory, easy prey for vengeful enemies. Even the most successful raiders paid a toll that is hard for modern minds to fathom. The great Viking chieftain Bjorn Ironside, son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, made a long and daring excursion into the Mediterranean that saw him seizing towns in France, Spain, and Italy. In one engagement, Bjorn received a grievous wound that, according to the sagas, gave him his nickname when bits of his shattered rib protruded through the skin. But for all his successful raiding, Bjorn's Mediterranean adventure ended in disaster. After being blockaded in southern Italy, much of his army succumbed to disease. Bjorn himself survived both the plague and his battle injuries. But upon returning home to the Jutland Peninsula, he was ambushed and killed by agents of his own half-brothers, who had decided to claim their inheritance early. Thus, even a warrior of his renown was ultimately undone by the hardships of the raiding lifestyle and the infighting it fueled back home. For every raid carving a path of destruction abroad, countless more Vikings suffered and died, far from the attention of skalds and saga writers. This was the hidden price of the Viking expansion, paid in blood, hunger, sickness, and ceaseless struggle. Upon returning home, Vikings faced the daunting task of readjusting to everyday life. Many had left as untested youths hungry for glory. They returned as battle-scarred veterans, flush with treasure, but often nursing hidden wounds, of both the body and the mind. It was a jarring transition from the adrenaline-fueled intensity of the raiding season to the mundane, daily labours of the homestead. Some, no doubt, struggled to put down their swords and axes, yearning for the thrill of combat and the freedom of the open sea. Others tried to block out the memories of fallen friends and unspeakable acts committed in the heat of battle. Still others, returning with missing limbs or crippling injuries, faced the grim reality of reduced roles in a society that prized physical might above all else. Even those who escaped major injuries still had to grapple with the cumulative effects of the harsh raiding lifestyle. Joints aching from old wounds, lungs scarred by countless winter colds, and bouts of pneumonia aboard the longships. They returned to wives and children who had carried on without them, perhaps becoming strangers to their own families. Reintegration into the rhythm of village life was an unglamorous process, filled with long days spent repairing storm-damaged roofs, sharpening farming tools, and shoring up food supplies for the next winter. The transition could be humbling for men used to being hailed as conquering heroes and lavished with gold and silver. But this homecoming was an essential part of the Viking life cycle. The end of the raiding season was a time to rest, recover, and prepare to do it all again the next year. It was a chance to reconnect with loved ones and enjoy the hard-won fruits of their pillaging. And for a society so deeply invested in farming and husbandry, it was a time to put raiding in its proper perspective. Viking men spent more time sowing crops, birthing lambs, and mending fishing nets than swinging swords and boarding foreign shores. Unglamorous as it was, this prosaic labour formed the backbone of the Viking economy. Without it, the vaunted Norse raiders could never have sustained their far-flung campaigns of exploration and conquest. So the Vikings endured the whiplash of this annual cycle, from the roiling energy and mortal danger of the summer raids to the attritional labour and creeping ennui of the winter homestead. They shouldered the psychological weight of trauma and dislocation, buoyed by the promise of a glorious death and the hope of even greater plunder to come. But as the Viking Age progressed, these cyclical rhythms of raiding and recovery would be increasingly disrupted by a powerful cultural force emanating from the south, Christianity. The old Norse gods who smiled upon pillaging and promised feasts in Valhalla suddenly faced a formidable competitor in the strange new god from the desert lands far to the east. At first, the Christian incursion into the Viking heartlands met with staunch resistance. Norse paganism, with its rich pantheon of gods and promise of eternal battlefield glory, was deeply ingrained in the Viking psyche. Obdurate pagans like Radbod, king of the Frisians, reportedly refused baptism at the last moment upon learning that his Christian heaven would not reunite him with his glorious ancestors. But as Viking raiders returned with captives and tales of powerful Christian kingdoms, the new faith began to gain a foothold. Some Vikings converted out of expediency to smooth trade relations or political alliances with Christian neighbours. Others were drawn in by the promise of a more personal salvation or the chance to escape the constant cycle of feuding and vengeance. The conversion of Norway's king Olaf Tryggvason is a prime example of this religious sea change. Olaf took the throne in 995 after a youth spent raiding in the British Isles as a Viking mercenary. There he encountered Christian priests and, according to the sagas, even met with a mystical hermit on the Isles of Scilly who prophesied Olaf's destiny as the Christianizer of Norway. Upon claiming his crown, Olaf worked with singular focus to convert his people, often by force and threats. He brutally suppressed the old pagan practices, tearing down heathen idols and blinding or dismembering those who dared resist. Olaf's heavy-handed approach made him many enemies. After a reign of just 5 years, he died in battle against an alliance of pagan Danes and Swedes, as well as Christian Anglo-Saxons. But Olaf's death did not stop the spread of Christianity. Successive Norse kings saw the political advantages of conversion, which often came with lucrative ties to the Christian kingdoms of mainland Europe. The old Viking ways were on an irreversible decline. The age of unfettered raiding and pillaging was slowly but surely drawing to a close. Of course, this Christianization of the Norse lands was a slow, uneven process that played out over generations. The common people clung to their pagan ways longer than the rulers and nobility. Even nominally Christian kings hedged their spiritual bets. The sagas tell of warrior kings placing one hand on sacred arm rings to swear oaths to the pagan gods, while wearing a crucifix around the neck at the same time. Over time, however, Christianity sank deep roots into Norse culture and left its indelible mark on the Viking world. The great wooden stave churches of Scandinavia, with their dragon-headed gables and runic inscriptions, testify to this blending of the old and new faiths. By the late Viking Age, Norse warriors were just as likely to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem as to sail off on a raiding expedition. The fearsome Varangian guard of the Byzantine emperors was largely made up of Christianized Vikings, and in 1066, the last great Viking king, Harald Hardrada, died not on a raid, but in a failed attempt to claim the English crown and unite it with his own Norwegian kingdom, a political dream founded on his Christian credentials. Thus, in a twist of historical irony, the Vikings were undone as much by their own conversion as by any external military defeat. With the old pagan ways in retreat and the rise of centralized Christian monarchies, the age of the great heathen armies and freelance Norse raiders was at an end. The Viking world would have to find a new equilibrium in the second millennium. So as we come to the end of our journey through the Viking Age, we are left with a complex and nuanced picture. One that goes far beyond the popular image of axe-wielding brutes in horned helmets. To be a Viking was to live a life of constant struggle and adaptation, both against the harsh forces of nature and the rapidly shifting currents of politics and religion. At their height, the Vikings were the scourge of Europe, striking terror into the hearts of monks and monarchs from the Irish Sea to the Black Sea. Their longships were both feared and admired as the pinnacle of the seafarer's craft, and their pagan gods seemed to revel in the slaughter and destruction left in the Norsemen's wake. But these Vikings were also explorers, traders, farmers and craftsmen, human beings coping with the daily realities of life in a pre-modern world. They suffered from the same aches and illnesses, the same petty slights and family squabbles that have always been the lot of humankind. At sea and on the battlefields of Europe, they paid for their plunder with pain and blood. And in the end, the Vikings could not resist the tides of historical change. Their fierce independence and pagan fatalism yielded to the powerful impersonal forces of Christianization and monarchy. The Viking Age had been a time of astonishing dynamism and growth for the Norse people, but it was ultimately unsustainable in the face of a changing medieval world. Today, we remember the Vikings as much for their rich mythology and material culture as for their martial prowess. Their myths and sagas continue to inspire works of fantasy and historical fiction, and their intricate artistic styles, like the famous gripping beasts motif, still fascinate jewelry and tattoo enthusiasts alike. But perhaps the real legacy of the Vikings is in their very spirit of striving against all odds. Theirs was a world where life was often brutish and short, and yet they achieved remarkable things within the confines of their time and place. From the great ships they built, to the far shores they discovered, and even to the new god they eventually embraced. In that sense, we modern listeners are not so far removed from our Viking forebears. We too must adapt and endure in a world that can often seem harsh and unforgiving. So even as we drift off into the arms of sleep, we might spare a thought for those intrepid men and women of the North and the ceaseless struggle that defined their age. Let's continue our exploration of the harsh realities of Viking life by turning to Viking gender roles. Pop culture depictions of Vikings conjure images of burly, bearded men raiding across the seas. But this ignores half the population: Viking women. While women were essential to Viking society, their lives were often difficult and constrained. In Viking culture, women were primarily responsible for the domestic sphere. When Viking men went off raiding each summer, women were left in charge of farms and families. This meant endless hours of grinding grain, tending animals, preparing food, making clothing, and raising children. With their husbands absent for months at a time, Viking women had to be resilient and resourceful to keep households running smoothly. But this doesn't mean Viking women had much power or autonomy. While they wielded influence within the home, Viking women had very limited rights and freedoms. They rarely had any say in who they married, as marriages were arranged by male relatives for political or economic reasons. Once married, women were essentially the property of their husbands. Viking law did offer women some limited protections, such as the right to divorce in certain circumstances. But in practice, women had few avenues to exercise power or escape unhappy situations. The best most women could hope for was to be widowed, which granted them a degree of independence unheard of for married women. There were occasional exceptions to these bleak gender norms, rare women who managed to defy convention and carve out their own paths. One such woman was Sigrid the Haughty, a Swedish queen who lived in the late 10th century. Sigrid was beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely independent. According to Norse sagas, Sigrid was a wealthy widow before she caught the eye of King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. Harald proposed to Sigrid, but she refused him, supposedly saying she'd had enough of ruling the little frog pond of Sweden and had no desire to rule the bigger frog pond of Denmark. Enraged at her rejection, Harald threatened to invade Sweden if she didn't accept his proposal. But Sigrid didn't back down. She gathered allies and prepared her defences, forcing Harald to abandon his plans to take her and her lands by force. While the historicity of this dramatic saga is questionable, Sigrid's story took on mythic resonance as an example of a woman who rejected subjugation and forged her own path. But Sigrid's story is the exception that proves the rule. For the vast majority of Viking women, life was full of hard labour and limited choices. Their worth was primarily tied to their role as mothers and homemakers. While undeniably vital to their families and communities, Viking women were afforded little freedom or opportunity to determine their own fates. As we explore the popular image of Vikings as masters of the sea, it's important to remember the other side, the women who kept the home fires burning. Their labour and sacrifices were essential to Viking society, even as they were denied the chance to participate in that society as full equals. The plights and occasional triumphs of Viking women are an important part of this complex historical picture. From here, let's turn our attention to another often overlooked aspect of Viking life: health and diet. The Viking Age is so associated with warfare and conquest that it's easy to forget these were real people, with all the mundane concerns and maladies that entails. But in a pre-modern world of poor nutrition and non-existent healthcare, staying hale and hearty was no simple feat. The Viking diet was constrained by what was available in their harsh northern climate. Scandinavia's thin soil, short growing seasons, and limited space for grazing animals meant that Vikings subsisted on a rather narrow set of staples. Meat and fish were the mainstays of their diet, usually supplemented with rye, barley, oats, and some hardy vegetables like cabbage and onions. This protein-rich but rather unvaried diet had its advantages and drawbacks. On the one hand, it provided Vikings with the strength and stamina needed for their strenuous lifestyles of farming, sailing, and fighting. The famous Viking berserkers were renowned for working themselves into a battle frenzy, and some historians have speculated their vigour may have been fueled in part by their meat-heavy diets. But this came at a cost. The lack of fruits and vegetables in the typical Viking diet would have led to deficiencies in key nutrients like vitamin C. This, combined with the general lack of hygiene and sanitation in Viking life, contributed to health problems like scurvy, iron deficiency, and parasitic infections. And in the close confines of Viking longhouses, diseases could spread quickly, with devastating effects. Despite their hardships, some Vikings were renowned for their strength and hardiness. One famous example is Gunnar Hamundarson, an Icelandic chieftain from the 10th century. According to the Icelandic sagas, Gunnar once walked for 24 hours straight across the highlands of Iceland on a hunting trip, not stopping to eat or rest. His stamina was so great that his companions struggled to keep up, even as they paused to sleep and recover. When they finally returned home, Gunnar supposedly said, "Good companions you are, but unevenly tough. I have gone better on my feet before, but I have never met any to match you at sitting." For the famously understated Vikings, this dry quip was high praise. Gunnar walked his talk, quite literally, showcasing the rugged vitality required to thrive in the harsh world of the Vikings. But Gunnar and Vikings like him were up against steep odds. Without access to modern medicine, Vikings succumbed to illness and injury at staggering rates. Mortality was especially high for infants and young children, with perhaps a quarter to half of all Viking children dying before age 5. For those who survived to adulthood, life expectancy was still only around 40 to 50 years. In this context, growing old as a Viking was an achievement in itself. Those lucky few who made it to their golden years would have been revered for their hardiness and good fortune. With age came wisdom and authority, and elderly Vikings were looked to as leaders and sources of valuable knowledge and oral history. But there was no peaceful retirement for aging Vikings. Life was laborious right up until the very end. Those who could no longer swing a sword or row a ship were still expected to contribute to their families and communities, whether that meant watching grandchildren, repairing fishing nets, or offering sage counsel to younger generations. So while movies tend to depict Vikings in their battle-ready prime, the reality is that the Viking world was filled with people of all ages and abilities, each struggling in their own way to survive and thrive. From cradle to grave, good health was a precious and precarious commodity, something to be safeguarded and celebrated whenever possible. As we've seen, even seemingly mundane aspects of Viking life offer surprising windows into the challenges and complexities of this era. Next time, we'll examine how these daily struggles played out in perhaps the most central space in Viking society, the home. Until then, rest well and dream of a time when every day was a hard-won victory against an uncaring world. There is still much to uncover in this boring history of the Vikings. As we've seen, the Viking Age was a time of great change and upheaval in Scandinavia. The old ways were slowly giving way to the new, as Christianity spread throughout the region. This process of Christianization was far from smooth or even, and it played out in different ways for different Vikings. Take the story of Olaf Haraldsson, later known as Olaf the Saint. Born into a powerful Norwegian family around 995 AD, Olaf spent his youth as a Viking raider, pillaging and plundering throughout the Baltic and North Seas. But during a raid on Normandy, Olaf reportedly had a spiritual awakening and converted to Christianity. Returning to Norway, Olaf set about forcibly converting his fellow Vikings to the new faith. As king, he destroyed pagan temples, burned Norse idols, and imposed strict Christian laws and practices. While some embraced the change, others resisted fiercely. Olaf made many enemies and was eventually forced into exile. But Olaf's legacy lived on. After his death in battle in 1030, he was declared a martyr and a saint. His shrine in Trondheim became an important pilgrimage site and a symbol of Norway's emerging Christian identity. Olaf came to be seen as Rex Perpetuus Norwegi, the eternal king of Norway. Of course, not all Vikings embraced Christianity so readily. Many clung to their traditional Norse beliefs and practices, even as the world around them changed. The sagas tell of fierce battles between Christian and pagan Vikings, each side convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Gradually, though, Christianity took hold. Pagan traditions were absorbed and adapted, melding with the new faith in unique ways. Norse gods and myths found echoes in Christian saints and stories. The old runestones with their pagan imagery gave way to new ones carved with crosses and Christian inscriptions. By the end of the Viking Age in the 11th century, Scandinavia was a very different place than it had been just a few centuries earlier. The fierce pagan warriors of the sagas had given way to Christian kings and saints. The old Norse gods were fading into myth and legend. It was the end of an era. As we've journeyed through the Viking Age in this series, I hope I've given you a sense of what life was really like for these fascinating people. Though the popular image of Vikings as bloodthirsty barbarians isn't entirely wrong, it fails to capture the full complexity of their society and culture. Yes, Vikings could be violent raiders and ruthless warriors, but they were also farmers and traders, explorers and settlers, poets and lawmakers. They lived in a harsh and unforgiving world, one where life was often brutal and short. But they met those challenges with remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and even humour. So the next time you see Vikings on the big screen, spare a thought for the real history behind the Hollywood image. Remember the hardships and triumphs, the myths and realities that made the Vikings such a truly unique and unforgettable people. Thank you so much for journeying back with me through the Viking Age in this series. I hope you've enjoyed our trip through this fascinating corner of history. If so, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more adventures through the rich tapestry of our shared past. Until next time, sweet dreams.